The third week of her service at Ravensmoor, on a night when the great house had gone dark, and the wind worked at the loose slate above the scullery, Selah Crowther stood frozen in the cold passage behind the pantry, with a candle she had not dared to light, and listened to two men decide how the Duke would die. She had come down for the breakfast linens, nothing more. The corridor that ran behind the still room was narrow and unlovely, a servant's vein through the body of the house, and she had walked it 100 times by then without thinking. That night the door to the steward's room stood open, the width of a hand, and the lamplight inside fell yellow across the flags, and the voices that reached her were low and unhurried, the voices of men who believed themselves entirely alone. "A small measure in the morning chocolate," one of them said. "Not enough to be felt. Then a little more across the week, and by the turn of the month a wasting that any physician in the county would call a weakness of the blood." Selah did not breathe. Her hand had gone to the cold plaster of the wall and stayed there, and she felt her own heartbeat in the pads of her fingers, fast and shameful, as though the wall itself might carry the sound of it into that lamp-lit room. She was 19 years old, and 4 weeks from the only roof that would take her, and she understood, standing there, that she had heard a thing she was never meant to hear, and that the hearing of it had already changed everything. The other voice answered, and it was smoother, and she knew it. She had heard it that very afternoon in the hall, courteous and dry, instructing a footman about the wine. The cousin, the men called him below stairs. Mr. Falca. Bet. He said the apothecary in Tewkesford could be trusted to ask no questions, and that the steward should see to the dosing himself, since the kitchen was full of fools, who could not be relied upon to keep a thing quiet. "A wasting of the blood," Mr. Falca said again. And there was something almost gentle in how he said it. "By Lady Day, the title comes to me, and you keep your place under a master who remembers his friends." The candle trembled in Selah's grip. She drew back one step, and then another, setting each foot down as though the floor were ice over deep water, and she did not turn until the passage bent and the lamplight was lost behind her. Then she ran. She ran in stockinged feet up the back stair with her heart going like a hare's, and she did not stop until she was in the cold little room under the eaves that she shared with no one, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark and pressed both hands over her mouth and tried to make herself believe she had dreamed it. She had not dreamed it. That was the trouble. She knew the steward's voice as well as she knew the creak of the third stair, and she knew Mr. Desty, Falcase, and she had heard the word poison shaped plainly in the mouth of a gentleman who would inherit a dukedom if a particular man stopped breathing before the spring. Stay with me a moment, because what happened to her next is the part that matters. You would think that a girl who had overheard murder would only have to speak, and be believed, and be thanked. You would think the world arranges itself around the truth. It does not. And Selah was about to learn how little a truth weighs when the mouth that carries it belongs to no one the world has agreed to hear. She did not sleep. She lay rigid until the window grayed, and by the time the house stirred, she had decided that she would tell Mrs. Sangrove, the housekeeper, because Mrs. Sangrove was the nearest thing to authority that a scullery maid might approach without being whipped for insolence. Mrs. Sangrove heard her out in the linen room with her arms folded and her keys still at her waist, and her face did not change at all. When Selah had finished, the housekeeper let a silence sit between them, long enough to be its own answer. "You have been here 3 weeks," Mrs. Sangrove said at last. "You came to us off the parish road with 1 box, and no character to speak of, because Mr. Falca himself spoke for you, out of a Christian charity I begin to think was wasted. And you stand in my linen room and tell me that same gentleman means to murder his cousin, the Duke." Selah had not known that. She had not known that it was Mr. Prink. Falca, who had brought her into the house in the knowing of it, now turned the floor under her. She had been placed here. She had been placed here by the very man, and she could not have said even to herself, whether it was chance or design only, that it made her smaller in that room than she had been a moment before. "I know what I heard," she said. "You heard the wind," said Mrs. Sangrove, "and the pipes, and your own fancy, which is overfed. For a girl in your place, and you will not carry one word of this fancy below stairs, nor above it, nor to the village, nor to a living soul, or I will have you back on the parish road by nightfall, with a character that follows you into every kitchen in the county. Do you understand me?" She understood. That was the whole of it. She understood that she had been heard and dismissed in the same breath, and that the dismissal had teeth. Let me tell you what Ravensmoor was, so that you can see her standing inside it. It was one of the great houses of the north, grey stone and tall windows set in a park where the deer moved like brown smoke under the oaks, and it had belonged to the same family since before anyone in the village could name the first of them. The Duke was the last of his line that mattered. There had been a younger brother, dead of a fever in the islands, and a father 3 years in the family vault, and a mother longer gone than that, and now there was only Rowan, who was 34 years old, and a widower of 2 winters, and who walked his own grounds in the early dark, as though he were looking for something he had set down and could not find. Selah had seen him only twice. Once across the stable yard, where he stood with his hand on the neck of a grey horse, and said nothing to anyone for the better part of an hour, and once on the gravel beneath the terrace, very late, when she had been sent to fetch in the dog and had nearly walked into him in the dark. He had looked at her then with eyes the color of slate after rain, and he had said only, "Mind the step, it ices over here," and gone in. She had thought him cold. The whole county thought him cold. The Duke, who buried his wife, and did not weep, they said in Tewkesford, the Duke, with stone, where his heart had been. What she came to understand, slowly, over the days that followed, was that the coldness was a thing he wore, the way she wore her one good apron, because, beneath it, was something he could not afford to let the world handle. That came later. On the morning after the linen room, she knew only that she had warned the one person she was permitted to warn, and that it had cost her, and that the chocolate would be carried up to the Duke's breakfast room, as it was carried every morning, in a covered silver pot, by a footman who knew nothing. So she did the only thing left to a girl who is believed by no one. She watched. She learned the hours. She learned that the chocolate was prepared in the still room by a girl named Nell, who could not have plotted her way out of a hedge, and that the steward, Mr. Doggett, came each morning to the still room on the pretext of the household accounts, and stood by the table where the pot waited under its cloth, and was sometimes alone with it for the length of a held breath. She learned that Mr. Doggett carried a small horn snuff-box that he never once opened to take snuff. She learned where his eyes went when the door opened, and how his hand returned too smoothly to his side. On the 4th morning, she contrived to be in the still room, scouring a copper pan when he came, and she watched his hand move toward the pot, and she dropped the pan with a crash that brought Nell round and the undercook to the door, and Mr. Doggett drew back his hand and frowned at her as a gentleman frowns at a clumsy animal, and said that she ought to be turned off for noise, and went out. The pot went up untouched that morning. Selah scoured pans until her knuckles bled and said nothing. She could not crash a pan every morning. She knew that. A girl who is forever underfoot is a girl who is dismissed, and a dismissed girl could not watch at all. She needed someone above her station to listen, and the housekeeper had closed that road, and there was no one else. There was the gardener. Old Ben, who had kept the grounds at Ravensmoor for 40 years, and remembered the Duke as a boy with skinned knees, and who took his dinner alone in the potting shed and spoke to almost no one. Selah had carried his dinner out twice when the kitchen was short of hands, and he had thanked her gravely each time, which no one else in the house had troubled to do. On the 5th evening she carried it out again, though it was not her task, and she sat on the upturned barrow while he ate, and she told him, old Ben did not call her a fool. That was the first kindness. He set down his bread and looked at her a long moment with his pale, watering eyes, and he said, "The cousin, you say? Mr. Folka, and the steward." "I know how it sounds," Selah said. "I know how it is," said old Ben, which was a different thing. He told her slowly, turning the bread in his fingers, that Mr. Fulke had been about the house a great deal of late, where in former years he had come once a 12-month, and gone again as quick as he could. He told her that there was a codicil business afoot, papers the steward carried back and forth to the lawyers in the town, and that the talk in the stable was that the Duke meant to alter the inheritance away from the cousin and toward a charity, a school for the foundlings of the parish, which had been the dead Duchess's project before she died. He told her that, if such a thing were signed, Mr. Falke would have nothing, so he must do it before the signing, Selah said, and felt the cold of the still-room passage come back into her hands. Before Lady Day, said old Ben. He looked at her. You cannot go to the Duke. He will not see a maid. And if you are wrong, you are turned off. And if you are right and they learn you spoke, you are worse than turned off. I know, said Selah. Then we watched the pot, said the old man. And it was the first time anyone had said we, and she could have wept at it. We watch the pot, and we wait for a thing we can put in his hand that he cannot wave away. The dismissive verdict followed her even into the comfort of that we. She heard it 3 days later in the kitchen, where the upper servants took their tea, when Mrs. Sangrove remarked to the cook, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that the new scullery girl had a fevered imagination and a habit of carrying tales, and that she, for one, did not trust a creature who repaid charity with slander. It was said as a warning to the others, and it worked. The kitchen maids drew their skirts in when Selah passed. She had become, in the house's settled opinion, a girl who lied. There is a particular loneliness in being thought a liar when you have told the only truth you possess. And she carried it down the back stairs each morning and up each night, and she did not let it bend her. What she had instead was patience, and a gardener, and a growing careful knowledge of the enemy. She learned Mr. Falke. She learned to read him across a room. He was a handsome man of perhaps 40, smooth-shaven and smiling, with a way of touching the elbows of those he spoke to that the footmen found gracious and Selah found like the laying of a net. He was kind to the servants in the manner of a man who knows that kindness is cheaper than wages. He praised the cook's pastry and remembered the names of the groom's children, and he asked, more than once and always lightly, after the new girl, the quiet one, the one Mrs. Sangrove had taken against. Selah understood that she was being measured. The man who had placed her in the house was watching to see what she had become inside it, and she gave him nothing to see. She bobbed and looked at the floor, and was stupid for him, magnificently stupid, and felt his interest drift off her like water off oiled cloth. It was the right instinct. It was also not enough, because the morning came when she could not be in the still room, and old Ben could not, and the covered pot went up the great stair in the footman's careful hands, and there was nothing on God's earth she could do but follow it with her eyes to the turn of the landing. She did not lose it entirely. She had learned the house by then, the way a hunted thing learns its ground. She knew that the breakfast room had a second door, a jib door, papered to match the wall that gave onto the same back passage as the still room, and that the passage was hers because it was a servant's passage, and no gentleman would think to walk it. She slipped down it while the footman went up by the grand stair, and she put her eye to the crack of the jib door, and she watched the Duke of Ravensmore sit alone at a long table in the grey morning light and reach for the silver pot. She had not planned what she did next. There was no plan in it at all. She struck the jib door with the flat of her hand hard, so that it banged in its frame like a thing the wind had taken, and she fled. The Duke set down the pot. A servant came, and another, and the jib door was examined and found to be only a door the wind had caught, and the latch was seen to. And by the time the fuss had settled, the chocolate had gone cold and was carried away undrunk. Selah had bought one more morning, with a slap of her palm and a sprint down a dark passage, and she leaned against the cold wall at the foot of the back stair with her chest heaving, and understood that she could not do even this for very much longer. The dosing was meant to be slow, a measure, then a little more. Every cold pot carried away was a day she had stolen back, and the days were running out toward Lady Day like sand from a cracked glass. That night she could not eat. Old Ben found her in the kitchen yard and made her sit, and he told her a thing that changed the shape of the danger. "The apothecary," he said. "Trench, in Tewkesford. My nephew drives the cart there for the seed. He says Doggett the steward has been to Trench 3 times this month and bought what no household buys 3 times in a month. Trench keeps a book. By law, he keeps a book of every poison sold, who bought it and why. Signed." "A book," said Selah. "A book?" "The Duke would believe," said old Ben, "because it is in the law's own hand, and not a maid's. If a man could lay Trench's book before his grace, with Doggett's name in it and the dates, no housekeeper alive could call it fancy." The thought of it lit her like a coal. Then it darkened, because she saw the whole shape of the trouble at once. The apothecary was Mr. Falk's man. He would not show his book to a scullery maid. He would not show it to anyone. And if he were asked, he would send word straight back to the men who paid him, and then they would know that someone in the house was watching, and they would stop being slow and careful and patient. They would simply put the whole measure in one cup and call it an apoplexy and bury the Duke before the frost was off the ground. She said this to old Ben, and he was quiet a long time. "Then it must be taken," he said, "not asked for. Taken and put in the right hand the same day, before they know it is gone." They did not speak the rest of it aloud. They did not need to. She was the one who could not be missed for an afternoon, who could be sent to Tewkesford on a true errand, who was small and quiet and beneath notice. She was the only one of them the danger could not see. The errand came easier than she had any right to expect, and that ease should have warned her. The cook wanted ribbon and thread from the town, and Mrs. Sangrove, glad to have the troublesome girl out of the house for a day, gave her leave and a half-shilling and a list. Sella walked the 4 miles to Tewkesford, in a thin wind, with her heart in her throat, and old Ben's directions folded small in her glove, and she found the apothecary's shop on the market square with its bow window full of blue and green glass. And she stood across the street, and watched it until she had the courage to do what she had come to do. She did not go in to buy. She went in at the slack hour after noon, when Trench took his dinner in the back, and she had timed it by the nephew's account. And she found the front shop empty and the poison book exactly where old Ben's nephew had said it would be, on a slope of desk near the dispensing counter, chained at the spine but open, because a chained book that is consulted daily is not a book anyone troubles to close. Her hands shook. She did not take the book. She could not have hidden a chained ledger under her shawl, and the theft of it would have screamed her errand to the heavens. Instead, she did the thing she had decided on in the long night, the thing that made her hands steady even as they trembled. She read, and she remembered. She found the recent pages, and there in a cramped commercial hand were the entries, and there was the name Doggett, 3 times across the month, and the substance named plainly, and beside each the false reason, vermin in the granary, and the date, and the signature. She fixed the dates in her mind the way she had once fixed her catechism, by repeating them under her breath until they were part of her. Then, because she was a poor man's daughter who had once kept her father's accounts, she did one thing more. She found a stub of pencil and a corner torn from the cook's list, and she copied the 3 entries in full fast, her ear pricked toward the curtain at the back, and she had just folded the scrap into her glove when the curtain stirred, and Trench came through wiping his mouth. He looked at her, a thin, plain girl in a parish shawl, and saw nothing worth seeing. She asked in a small voice for a pennyworth of peppermint lozenges for her mistress's stomach, and paid from the half-shilling, and bobbed, and went out into the market square with the law's own evidence copied in her own hand, hidden against her wrist, and the whole long road home to be afraid in. She was right to be afraid. She did not know yet how right. The thing she had not weighed, walking home lighter than she had felt in weeks, was that a careful man keeps a careful watch, and that Mr. Falke had not become a man who could plan a murder by trusting to the discretion of paid apothecaries. Trench, uneasy at a strange girl asking after lozenges at the dinner hour, in a shawl that marked her from the Ravensmore parish, had sent his boy to the great house with a word. and the word had reached the steward before Sella's feet had carried her halfway home. She came in at dusk by the kitchen door, and the house had a wrongness to it that she felt before she could name. Mrs. Bree. Sangrove was waiting in the passage with 2 of the footmen behind her, and her face was no longer merely cold. It was frightened, and a frightened authority is the most dangerous kind. "Your box is to be searched," the housekeeper said. "There has been a theft. A brooch of the late Duchess's gone from the blue room, and you the only one of the household off the premises this day." Selah understood it instantly, the whole clean shape of it, and the understanding was almost admiration. They could not accuse her of what she had truly done without naming the thing she had truly found. So they accused her of something else, something a scullery maid is always already half guilty of, and they would turn her off in disgrace before the sun rose, and her word would be worth less than nothing. The word of a thief, and the copied entries in her glove would be the ravings of a girl caught stealing and grasping at any tale to save her skin. The brooch was found in her box. Of course it was. It had been put there while she walked to Tewkesford, and back Mrs. R. Sangrove drew it out from beneath Sella's one spare shift and held it up in the candlelight. And the footman looked away, and the housekeeper said in a voice that shook, that she had known from the first that the girl was bad, that she had said as much to the cook, that charity to such creatures was always repaid in this coin. This was the dark of it. Standing in the cold passage, with the stolen brooch held up like a verdict, the copied evidence useless against her now, branded a thief by the only authority below stairs, 4 miles from the apothecary, and a locked stair away from the one man whose life she had spent 3 weeks trying to save. Sella Crowther came as near to despair as she had ever been. They would put her out at dawn. The codicil would not be signed. The slow measure would go into the morning chocolate day after day, and there would be a wasting of the blood, and a quiet funeral, and a new duke who remembered his friends. And no one in the wide world would ever know that a scullery maid had stood in a dark passage and tried, with nothing but her 2 hands and her stubborn memory, to hold off a murder. The grief of it was worse than the fear. She had not known until that moment how much she had come to want him to live. The cold gray man on the gravel who had told her to mind the step. She did not weep. She had learned, in 19 hard years, that weeping spent strength she could not afford. She stood very straight in the passage, and she said quite clearly, so that both footmen heard her and would remember it, that she had taken nothing, and that there was a book in Tewkesford, in the apothecary's own hand, that the Duke ought to see before the month was out, and that they might lock her where they liked, but she would say it to his Grace's face if she had to scream it through the floor. Mrs. Sangrove went white. "Lock her in the box-room," she said too quickly, "and send word to Mr. Belloc's Pry. Dog it that the matter is dealt with. The Duke is not to be troubled with servants' business." They locked her in the box-room, under the eaves, a windowless space hung with the dust-sheeted furniture of dead seasons, and they took her candle, and she heard the key turn and the footsteps go, and she sat down on a shrouded chair in the dark and made herself think. She had 2 things. She had the copied entries, which they had not found because they had searched her box, and not her gloves, the gloves she had worn into the house and never taken off. And she had old Ben, who would miss her at his dinner, and know, the moment he heard the brooch story, exactly what it was. She did not know whether one old gardener could reach a duke. She knew only that he was the single thread left, and that she must trust it, because the alternative was to sit in the dark and let a good man be poisoned by inches. It was past midnight when she heard the scratch at the box-room door. Not the key. A blade, working at the old wards of the lock, patient and sure. And her heart stood still until old Ben's voice came through the wood. "Low as the wind. Sella, be quiet now. I have kept this lock these 40 years, and it has no secrets from me." The door gave. The old man stood in the passage with a shielded lantern and a face carved out of grief and fury. He had heard the brooch story from the footman who could not stomach it. He had known it for a lie, and he had not come to free her and run, because there was nowhere to run that the morning would not find them. "He has gone to London." old Ben whispered the Duke. 3 days on the business of the codicil to sign it in his lawyer's chambers where Doggett cannot reach the papers. He rides back the day after tomorrow. They know it. Doggett and the cousin. They mean to do it the morning he returns the whole measure at once. In the welcome cup, while the house is glad, and no one is watching the pot. An apoplexy, they will say, from the hard road and the cold. And you will be long gone by then, turned off for a thief. Your word worth nothing. Then we have until he returns, said Selah, and she was on her feet, and the despair had burned off her like mist. We have the copied book, and we have a day, and we have a man who will be glad to be alive when he learns what was meant for him. We do not need the housekeeper to believe me. We do not need a single soul in this house. We need only to put the truth in the Duke's own hand before he lifts that cup, in front of witnesses who cannot be sent away. Old Ben looked at her. The parish girl with the stolen brooch still warm against her name, and something in his old face changed, and he nodded as a man nods to an equal. There is a magistrate, he said. Sir Gilbert Moe at the hall beyond the village. An honest man and no friend of Falke, who once cheated him at a horse sale, and was never forgiven. If the law itself stood in the courtyard when the Duke came home, with the apothecary's own entries to read, no housekeeper and no steward could lock a door fast enough. They could not go that night. A maid and a gardener, walking the dark roads, would be marked and stopped. The next day, though, was market day in Tewkesford, when half the household went down for the fair, and a scullery girl supposed already gone, and an old gardener about his ordinary errands could pass unremarked along the very roads that the danger watched. Old Ben hid her through the morning in the warm dark of the potting shed among the seed trays and the smell of earth, and at noon, while the steward believed her shamed and fled, and the cousin counted the hours to a death he had arranged, Selah Crowther walked out of Ravensmoor a second time, not as a thief running, but as a witness going to fetch the law. Sir Gilbert Moe was a square, grey, plain-spoken man, who did not at first want to see a maidservant and a gardener at his door. Old Ben, though, had carried apples to the hall for 40 years, and was known for an honest tongue, and he stood his ground in the cold porch and said only that there was a man's life in it, and the law's own evidence to show, and the magistrate grumbling. Let them stand before his fire. Selah did the rest. She had rehearsed it on the road until it was as smooth and hard as a river stone. She did not weep, or plead, or run ahead of herself. She laid it out as she had laid out her father's accounts, in order, with the dates, and she drew the torn scrap from her glove and put it in the magistrate's hand. The 3 entries copied in her own plain figures. Doggett's name, the substance, the false reason, the dates that marched straight toward Lady Day. She told him the entries could be proven against the apothecary's chained book in an hour. She told him of the codicil, and what Falke stood to lose by it, and what he stood to gain by a death before the spring. She told him of the slow measure in the morning chocolate, and the cold pots carried away, and the brooch put in her box, and she did not once say that he must believe her, because she had learned that the demand to be believed is the surest way to be doubted. She gave him the facts, and let the facts do their own work, and stood with her chapped hands folded while an honest man read murder in a torn corner of paper. Sir Gilbert Moe read it twice. Then he looked at her a long time, this thin girl in a Paris shawl who had walked 8 miles in 2 days to lay a poisoner before him, and he said slowly that he had known Falke for a smiling rogue these 15 years, and that there was a ring of truth in the thing that no liar could have forged. The small particular truths, the granary vermin, the snuff-box, that took no snuff. He sent a man on a fast horse to Tewkesford to set a watch on Trench and his chained book, that it might not be burned before the morning. And he told Selah and old Ben that he would be at Ravensmoor when the Duke rode home with 2 constables and the law at his back, and that no door in that house would be locked against him. The Duke of Ravensmoor came home on a grey forenoon with frost still in the hollows of the park, and the household turned out on the gravel to welcome him, the footmen in their best, the cook in a clean cap, Mrs. Sangrove with her keys bright at her waist and her face composed, and Mr. Falke at the foot of the steps with his hand already half extended and his smile already arranged. The steward stood a little behind, and in his hand was the welcome cup, the warm spiced wine that was carried out to a master returned from a hard road, and Sella, watching from among the constables at the edge of the courtyard, saw the morning light catch on the rim of it, and knew that the whole measure was in it, the slow death made sudden, and that there were perhaps 30 heartbeats between the Duke's cold hand and the cup. Rowan came down the steps stiff from the saddle, and his slate eyes went over the gathered household, as they always did, looking for the thing he could not name, and Mr. Pal guess. Falca stepped forward with the cup taken smoothly from the steward, and pressed it toward his cousin's hand, and said, in his warm, gracious voice, "Welcome home, cousin. You look perished. Drink, and be warm." The Duke's gloved fingers closed on the cup. "Your Grace," said Selah. She had not been told to speak. She had been told to stand among the constables, and be ready to swear what she had sworn to the magistrate, and Sir Gilbert was even then stepping forward with the law in his mouth. The cup, though, was at the Duke's lips, and the law was 3 seconds too slow, and so she said it herself, one word, his title, in a voice pitched to carry across the cold gravel, and every head in the courtyard turned to the thin maid in the worn grey shawl who had no business being there at all. "Do not drink it," she said. "There is poison in the cup. It is in the apothecary's book in Tewkesford. 3 times bought in the steward's own name, and the magistrate has read it, and he is standing at your gate." The silence that followed was the silence of a held breath in 100 throats. "Mr. Frawler." Falca's smile did not fall so much as it set, the way water sets to ice, and for one instant his eyes went to the steward, and the steward's hand twitched toward the cup as though to dash it from the Duke's grasp before it could be examined, and that small betraying motion, seen by every soul in the courtyard, was worth more than all the words Sella had spoken. Then Sir Gilbert Moe came forward with his constables, and the law has a weight that smiling cannot answer. What happened in the next hour was not the screaming reckoning the household had braced for. It was quieter and more terrible than that. The magistrate took the welcome cup, untouched, and sealed it. He named the apothecary's book and the watch he had set upon it, and he named the dates. And Mr. Falca, who is clever, saw at once that the slow, careful plot had become a chained ledger in the law's own hand, and that there was no smiling his way out of a poison book, signed by his own paid men. He tried. He was an active and a dangerous man to the very end, and he did not crumble at the first word as a coward would. He said smoothly that the maid was a proven thief, turned off that week for stealing the late Duchess's brooch, and that her word was the desperate slander of a creature caught. And he turned to Mrs. Bass, Sangrove, for confirmation. And for one breath, the old dismissive verdict hung in the air, with all its weight, the housekeeper's certainty that the girl was bad, the whole house's settled opinion that she lied. Sir Gilbert, though, had the copied entries and the chained book under watch 8 miles off, and he had something else. He had the steward, who was not a clever man, only a frightened one, and who saw a magistrate and 2 constables and a sealed cup, and understood that he alone would hang for a gentleman's scheme, while the gentleman smiled. Doggett broke. He broke there on the gravel, blurting that it was Falca's doing. All of it, the apothecary and the dosing and the brooch, in the maid's box, that he had only done as he was bid, and his blurting did in an instant what Selah's 3 weeks of patience could not have done alone. It turned the household's eyes from the maid to the cousin, and once turned, they could not be turned back. The Duke had not moved through any of it. He stood with the cup gone from his hand and his grey eyes on Selah, and the cold he wore like an apron was nowhere in his face. He had heard a scullery maid he had spoken to twice tell him that he had been 3 seconds from death, and that she had spent 3 weeks of her own peril keeping that death from his lips, while a house full of his own servants called her a liar and a thief. He looked at her as a man looks who has been shown, all at once, the exact measure of what he nearly lost and never knew he had. Sir Gilbert's men took the steward, and they would take the cousin to answer before the law, his lands and his expectations forfeit, his smiling done. There would be no duel, no blood on the gravel, no shot fired. The dukedom would not pass to him, and the codicil signed 3 days since in a London chamber would stand, and the foundling school the dead Duchess had dreamed of would be built after all, on the cousin's forfeited acres, which was a justice finer than any vengeance. Mr. Falk was not destroyed. He was exposed and stripped and led away a smaller man than he had walked in, and the worst of his punishment, Selah thought, watching his face, was that he had been undone not by a peer or a magistrate's cunning, but by a maid he had not troubled to count as a person, a girl he had placed in the house himself. I never once imagined could think. The household stood stunned on the gravel, and Mrs. Sangrove's keys were silent at her waist, and the housekeeper looked at the girl she had called bad, and could not meet her eyes. Selah did not gloat. There was nothing in her of triumph. She felt only a great weariness, and under it, like warmth coming back into a frozen hand, the simple astonishment of having been, at the last, believed. The Duke crossed the gravel to her. The whole courtyard watched him do it, the master walking to the maid, and he stopped before her at a proper distance, and looked down into her plain, tired face, and when he spoke it was not loud, but the cold morning carried it. "What is your name?" he said. "Selah Crowther, your grace." "Miss Crowther," said the Duke of Ravensmore, and the use of it, the miss laid on a scullery girl in front of the whole assembled house, was a thing they would speak of in the village for a year. "You have given me my life, and I did not even know it was in danger. There is no thanks equal to that. And you will not go back to the scullery, and you will not leave this house as anything less than its honored guest, for as long as you will stay." It was not a declaration. He was too careful a man, and she too lately a stranger for declarations on cold gravel. It was something better and slower. It was the beginning of being seen. She stayed. There was no question of the parish road now, no question of a character that followed her into kitchens. The brooch matter was undone in an afternoon, the lie of it plain once the larger lie had fallen. "Mrs. Sangrove offered stiffly, a kind of apology, and Selah took it without a word of reproach, because she had learned that grace costs the giver nothing, and is worth everything to the one who has been wrong. And old Ben was thanked by the Duke himself in the potting shed, man to man, and given a pension and a cottage with a south wall for his espaliers, and he wept. The old man, when no one but Selah was by to see it, and she pretended not to. The weeks that followed were strange and quiet. The Duke did not court her in any way the world would have recognized. He was a man 2 winters widowed and long shut against feeling, and he came out of it the way the frost comes out of the ground, slowly, from beneath. Still, he sought her company. He found reasons. He asked her to sit with him in the long library where the firelight moved on the leather spines, and he listened to her speak of her father, who had been an honest, failed corn factor and had taught his daughter her figures before he died, and she understood at last where her steady memory for dates and sums had come from, and that it had saved a life. The Duke told her, once in the low voice, he used for the things that cost him, of his wife, and the islands, and the brother, and the long cold years of being looked at by a county that had decided what he was. She did not pity him. She only listened, and he found, he said, that he could say things to her he had not been able to say to anyone, because she did not flinch from grief, and did not perform sympathy, but only received what was given and held it. There was an evening near the spring when they walked out on the terrace in the last gray light, and he stopped her at the head of the steps, with a hand at her elbow, the lightest pressure, and said, "Mind the step, it ices. Over here." And she heard the whole of it in the words, the first time he had spoken to her in the dark, the months between. The man he had been and the man he was letting himself become. She turned to look up at him, and the cold slate of his eyes was warm in the failing light. And he bent his head, and the kiss was soft and slow and full of a promise that needed no words to be certain, and there was nothing in it of the scullery or the long road home or the brooch in the box, only 2 people who had each spent a long while being unseen, finding at last that they were seen. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the Greystone church beyond the park, with old Ben in a new coat in the front pew, and Sir Gilbert Moe to give the bride away, for she had no father living to do it. The county came, of course, and the county talked. For a duke who marries a scullery maid is the talk of 3 seasons. The talk turned as talk does when it is given nothing to feed on but plain dignity. And within a year the new Duchess of Ravensmore was spoken of in Tewkesford, not as the maid who married above her, but as the woman who had saved the duke's life with her own 2 hands and her own clear head, which was the truth, and the truth, given time, outlasts every other story. The foundling school was built on the forfeited acres as the dead duchess had wished, and the new duchess saw to it herself, for she knew, better than anyone in the county, what it was to be a child the world had not troubled to count. The children there learned their letters and their figures, and Sella taught the first of them herself, in the early years the way her father had taught her, and more than one of those children grew up to keep honest accounts that someday saved them. On a winter evening near the end of that first year, when the snow lay blue on the park and the deer moved like smoke under the bare oaks, the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmore sat in the long library, with the fire low between them, and he had her hand in his, and he turned it over and looked at it as a man looks at a thing he has nearly lost and been given back. "You walked 4 miles to a magistrate," he said, not for the first time, with the old wonder still in it, on the word of one frightened gardener, when the whole house had called you a liar. "I knew what I had heard," she said, which was all she had ever had, and all she had ever needed. Outside, the snow went on falling over the gray stone and the bare oaks and the deer, and over the new school where the foundling slept warm, and over the road to Tewkesford that a thin girl in a Paris shawl had once walked with murder copied in her glove and no one in the world to believe her. Inside, the fire settled, and his thumb moved once across her knuckles, and neither of them spoke, because there are kinds of warmth that need no words at all, and they had each waited a long, cold while to be warm. If Sella's journey moved you, stay a moment in the quiet of it before you go, and let it sit with you the way the firelight sat with them. The world does not always weigh a truth by the rank of the mouth that carries it. Sometimes, though, if the one who carries it is patient and stubborn, and brave enough to walk the cold road anyway, the truth is heard at last and changes everything. Thank you for staying until the end.